It's my pleasure to chair this session with Brian Meeks and Lisa Lowe. Our timing is a little off, but that's absolutely fine. We're going to be going till about 1:35, taking a break then, and I'll tell you the rest later. But let me just introduce Brian, who is starting us off. He is a professor here and chair of Africana Studies at Brown, and who works on revolutions, radical movements, hegemony, and hegemonic dissolution, and is speaking to us today about hegemony. I'll introduce Lisa now, or? Do it now. No, do it now, okay. And Lisa, who is Distinguished Professor of English and Humanities and Director of the Center for the Humanities at Tufts. She's the author of books on French and British colonialism, race, immigration, globalization, and most recently, the colonial context for the emergence of liberalism in the Intimacies of Four Continents, which came out in 2015. So Brian, please start us off. Thank you.
Thanks, Anne. My paper is titled Hegemony and the Trumpian Moment. I've been thinking about hegemony in the Caribbean for more than 2 decades, utilizing the Gramscian notion that social formations are structured in dominance, but that domination is often not primarily executed through force. Rather, the social bloc in charge is able to produce and reproduce discourses and sets of ideas that give structure and shape to its apparent right to rule. Hegemony in this sense implies the weaving of a network of first, second, and third order ideas, beliefs, myths, gestures, and styles that come together to constitute a skein of common sense that provides justification for domination and its rightness and lays the foundation for consent through the assumption that the governmental project, its methods and effects make sense. Some corollaries to this include, first, that the netting of consent is always unraveling, always in dire need of patching and repair. And second, that it is permeable and that light invariably escapes from its confines. Yet to shift metaphors, as with a fisherman's net, some fish escape, but the net still serves its purpose of retaining a significant part of the catch within its confines. Or Stuart Hall, in capturing the tentative, unfinished character of the notion, suggests, quote, "It follows that hegemony can only be conceived as a historical process, not a thing achieved. But on the other hand, it is not merely the ongoing maintenance of rule and domination. It has to be specified empirically if the power of the ruling class or dominant bloc is in fact a moment of hegemony. Additionally, because hegemony is the establishment of the leading position on a variety of sites of social and political struggle, it includes domains that are usually ignored by Marxists, like the discourses of morality. Anybody who wants to command the space of common sense or popular consciousness and practical reasoning has to pay attention to the domain of the moral, since it is the language within which vast numbers of people actually set about their calculations, unquote from that long quote. I moved to the US to Brown in the late summer of 2015. In the following summer of 2016, Donald Trump was selected by the Republican Party as its presidential candidate, and I noted this strong sense of familiarity in the dissonance, antagonisms, and often sheer bad behavior that accompanied his campaign, and that reprised for me the social crisis of Jamaica as it approached what is often described as a near civil war situation before the 1980 general elections. I thought it worthwhile, therefore, to review the tools and methods that I've used to try to explain the recent history of Jamaica, a sort of Empire Strikes Back phenomenon, and to experiment with their applicability in what might be termed the Trumpian moment, which has consolidated with his unanticipated electoral victory in November 2016. In the Jamaican case, I use this notion to suggest that the social pact between, on the one hand, middle-class politicians and their social base, and on the other, insurgent workers and the poor, that encrypted this particular structure in dominance, operated within a very time-specific framework, bracketed by the popular labor riots of 1938 and their aftermath, of the bankruptcy of British colonialism coming out of World War II, and the pressure on the United Kingdom, significantly greater after Suez, to relinquish her colonies, of the social democratic impulses for economic welfare that had grown after the rebellion and were intersecting with the post-war political ascendancy of labor, of the glorious 30 years of economic boom after the war, which provided, even in the constricted, distorted economic space of the post-colony, an opportunity for rapid growth and an accompanying, if limited, social welfare experiment. However, by independence, things had already begun to fall apart. The closure of the safety valve of migration to the UK and the failure of the chosen strategy of industrialization by invitation to generate sufficient employment alongside the continuation of some of the most egregious features of colonialism in race and color barriers to employment and upward mobility had by the late 60s fostered deep social unrest. Accompanying this was a collapse of Creole nationalism and its replacement among the young of counter-hegemonic tendencies that forged different worldviews and explanatory frameworks, of which the most evident were the Black Power movement and closely allied to it Rastafarianism, which would acquire globally iconic status with the prominence of its musicians as vocalizers of what would become an international counter-hegemonic discourse in the 1970s and beyond. The democratic socialist interregnum of Michael Manley from 1972 to 80 witnessed a confluence of these new counter-hegemonic notions with a popular movement that surrounded and inhabited the institutional structure of his party. However, the new discourses departed in large measure from the conservative boundaries of the earlier social pact and gave wind to the sails of a movement that significantly undermined the laws, institutional structures, and social norms of colonial Jamaica. Manley's PNP, however, was defeated in the 1980 elections by a combination of a new global economic situation that was unfavorable to small mineral exporting states and a determined resistance from the local wealthy who feared their social and economic dominance was threatened, and they were fully supported by the United States as a global guardian of world capitalism. Manley's defeat in 1980, however, did not return the island to a new equilibrium. Instead, it has endured 4 decades of what I've suggested is hegemonic dissolution, in which counter-hegemonic discourses have continued to proliferate and in which the weakening of the state under pressure from neoliberal structural adjustment policies has provided space for the emergence of novel, quasi-statal, criminal political fiefdoms, which until recently have grown in strength and morphed into new and unprecedented forms. Yet, despite these threats to its survival, the institutional framework of two-party governance inherited from independence remains, though it has lost its gloss and natural right to rule. This impasse, underlined by the failure of the movement of the 70s and popular resentment from the poor over persistent economic stagnation, is manifest in cultural resistance and an unwillingness of the subaltern to live within the decent cultural markers of official society. But equally and critical in understanding the present moment is to grasp the failure of the subaltern majority to forge a new project of social emancipation from below. It is at this juncture of social incapacity on both sides and its implications for sclerosis and stasis that hegemonic dissolution is to be located. In summary, the post-war social pact, forged at the juncture of a favorable international moment, provided a period of relative stability, but its structural dominance was threatened in the 70s by a popular insurgency, which itself failed. The successive period of neoliberal dominance, which has lasted for close to 4 decades, has not been able to forge a new pact, but rather there has been a long hiatus of stagnation, anomie, limited growth, and all punctuated by violence, uncertainty, and an unprecedented migration, especially of the skilled and the capable. Before suggesting what these insights might bring to an appreciation of this Trumpian moment, it is perhaps worthwhile to think about how Stuart Hall sought to explain and understand an earlier British conjuncture which witnessed, parallel to Manley's demise in Jamaica, the consolidation of Thatcherism and the breaking up of the Keynesian welfarist consensus. First, in looking at the growth of Thatcherism with its anti-union, anti-collectivist essence, Hall sought to avoid both economistic and historically flattened readings of the process. He attacked the notion that every economic crisis invariably led to the same set of responses and outcomes as occurred in previous crises. Thus, he argued, the stock response to the shift in Britain to the right, proposing that Thatcherism was essentially fascism, was entirely misguided. History, he offered, was not a, quote, series of repeats, unquote. Rather, he suggested that what was emerging as the far Thatcherite right's response to the crisis of the 70s was an authoritarian populism, which, unlike classical fascism, quote, had retained most, though not all, of the formal representative institutions in place, and which at the same time has been able to construct around itself a popular consent, unquote. This popular consent, he suggests, was shaped out of existing commonsensical notions, values of Englishness, rights of the Englishman as an individual, as well as darker racist notions of white British superiority and the dangers of immigration. These, he argued, were now repurposed to weigh in against social welfare, socialized health, public education, and collectivism in general, to quote Hall again. It works on the ground of already constituted social practices and lived ideologies. It wins space there by constantly drawing on these elements which have secured over time a traditional resonance and left their traces in popular inventories. At the same time, it changes the field of struggle by changing the place, position, the relative weight of the condensations within any one discourse and constructing them according to an alternative logic, unquote. Thus, Hall concluded that it is through the massaging of multiple discourses that Thatcherism forged a new hegemonic initiative that strove to build and consolidate consensus around the unassailability and natural rightness of the marketplace, and captured in the now, 40 years later, well-battered but still surprisingly standing notion that there is no alternative. In returning to the contemporary moment in the US, it is useful to reassert that there is never a single hegemony with a single set of narratives and linguistic markers. Hegemony is sutured, sewn, and incomplete. Yet this leaves space for the lesser assertion that dominant hegemonies do exist for a time. There is also never a single insurgent counter-hegemonic narrative. Rather, these are multiple, fractured, and require significant, precisely suturing to present them as coherent, robust alternatives to their dominant competitors. What is the economic conjuncture that undergirds all of this? There has not been one, but we should recall at least 3 crises since the 30 years of the great post-war boom. The crisis of global inflation in the 70s, closely followed by the explosion of public debt of the 90s, and most recently, the crisis of private debt and the collapse of financial institutions in the Great Recession of 2008. Recovery from the Great Recession has been slow, and half a decade later, it is evident that generally jobs haven't recovered and may never recover, with large swathes of the population mired in poverty and hopelessness. This, more than anything else, is economic foundation for Trump's white, rural, Rust Belt male support. Answers to this are inevitably to be found in the dramatic restructuring of the world economy. First, and perhaps most profoundly, is the sharp rise in the use of robots, which explains in part the present sluggishness in employment, but certainly will have greater impact in the mid to long term, with some estimates suggesting that as much as 38% of US jobs might be taken over by robots in 15 years. Second, and more commonly understood, are the continuing effects of globalization, with jobs shifting from Michigan, Ohio, and Kentucky south of the border and racing to the bottom of ever cheaper labor markets. Many of the new jobs emerging in this environment are in non-unionized service sectors like fast food, retail, and self-employed urban transport, and carry none of the security and benefits of earlier unionized positions. Then in turn, the crash of many of these lower-paid jobs is already occurring as large-scale disruptive technologies utilizing social media and instant internet communication assume sectoral leaderships, requiring far fewer workers, even as they offer cheaper costs to the often unemployed or underemployed consumer. Persistent and entrenched unemployment in redundant sectors contributes to a third factor, which is the growth of inequality. In 2016, inequality in America reached new extremes, with the top 1% controlling 38.6% of the wealth, and the bottom 90% holding 22.8%, down from close to a third, that is the bottom 90 holding a third, when tracking of these statistics first began by the Fed in 1989. A fourth consideration is a shift over the past 20 years to rapid product differentiation in financial markets, and more recently their quantum digitization, which has increased the flow and efficiency of trading, leading to vast new accumulations of wealth harvested at the margins of financial transactions and fast trading digital futures markets. Wolfgang Streeck, employing some of these statistics in his bleak prophecy for the future of capitalism, proposes that the present moment is defined by the compounding of intersecting crises, of which he mentions 5. Growth is giving way to stagnation is his first. Second, in instances where there is economic progress, it is less shared. Third, the long interregnum of neoliberalism has starved the public space, leading to damaged infrastructure across the board. Fourth, corruption, held at the margins in the first post-war decades, has now become rife. And fifth, the capitalist system, held together by the Cold War and US dominance in the West, is now adrift with potential for increasing anarchy. Streeck, in developing each of these themes, argues that capitalism as we presently understand it will probably soon collapse, but will not necessarily be replaced by something coherent or better for a long time. Further discussion around each of these themes before arriving at Streeck's precipitous conclusions is, of course, urgently necessary. What is apparent, though, is that the sense that it is not business as usual, that government is not serving its purpose, and that the wealthy and powerful set the rules and run the system for themselves is palpable and driving narratives across the political spectrum in what I suggest is a moment of hegemonic dissolution. Was there ever a coherent meta-narrative that has brought together significant sections of America under one netting? While avoiding some imaginary original moment, we can suggest that perhaps in the post-war context of unprecedented economic growth and accompanied by Cold War anti-communism, consolidating notions of American exceptionalism and unreconstructed masculinism, there was a framework that dominated among some sectors and for a while, particularly if we were to exclude much of the black population, particularly those in the segregated South from the picture. This somewhat coherent hegemony, white and male in its structuring of dominance, hasn't existed for some time. If we think about the impact of the countercultural movements of the 60s, the civil rights movement, Black Power, and the anti-war movement. However, I think it is useful to consider the extent to which there has been movement away from this imaginary moment. A useful place to begin, particularly in light of the purported resurgence of the religious right in the ranks of the Republican Party and thus in the country's decision-making structure, is the extent to which the polls tell us a number of different things. And here I choose randomly, beginning with attitudes to religion. Pew's 2017 poll, asking whether it was necessary to believe in God to be moral, found that 56% felt it was not necessary, an increase of some 7% from 2011, when the figure was 49% feeling that way. On the attitude to same-sex marriage, in 2001, Americans opposed same-sex marriage by 57% to 35%. In 2017, this had shifted significantly to support for same-sex marriage by 62% in favor to 32% opposed. On the attitude as to whether interracial marriage was a good thing, in 2010, and forgive me for not putting this up on a screen, so you can ask me the details later on. In 2010, 24.5% of another Pew poll had signaled yes, it was. But by 2017, this had increased to 39%, that is from 24% to 39%. On the other hand, as to whether it was a bad thing, in 2010, 13% thought so, and by 2017, this had fallen by 4 points to 9%. On the central question of the nature of the economic system, a 2016 Harvard University poll asked whether there was support for capitalism and found that a slight majority of 51% of millennials did not support capitalism, with only 42% supportive of it. When asked about favorability to socialism, the same poll found some 33% supportive of socialism. Only among the cohort of respondents more than 50 years old were the majority in favor of capitalism. The Washington Post, in its report on the Harvard study, compares it with a 2011 Pew poll, which found a similar figure of 47% having negative views of capitalism. But that poll found that in relation to a positive perception of socialism, 49% held positive views, while 42% were negative. On general questions of people's attitudes to politics and the state of the country, 7 in 10 persons in a 2017 Washington Post poll concluded that politics had reached a dangerous new low point. The same poll found that there was deep and growing distrust for the political sphere. In 2017, only 14% of those polled felt that politicians were ethical and honest. In a 1987 poll, on the contrary, that figure was 39%. So if we compare both polls, a fall from 39% minority feeling politicians were unethical to 14%. On the open-ended question as to what were the causes for dysfunction in the political system, the 2017 poll, the largest cohorts, some 65%, responded that it was the undue influence of money in politics. This was followed by 56% asserting that it was due to the influence of wealthy political donors. A similar percentile said it was because of the influence of people with extreme political views, while 51% concluded that it was due to one man, that being Donald Trump. When asked as to whether divisions in the country were as bad as during the Vietnam War, a significant majority of 70% concluded that it was at least as bad. What do these admittedly somewhat randomly selected polls tell us when read through the lens of hegemony? First, and self-evident to anyone who has lived through or observed the last 2 years of life in the United States, is that there is a sharply, perhaps irreconcilably divided polity. On the one hand, there's a large minority of entrenched adherents to the hoary constellation of white masculinist hegemonic narratives. This central core of racism, homophobic, xenophobic, nationalist, and revanchist views dominates among anywhere from a quarter to more than a third of the adult population. Opposed to this, there is a growing counter-hegemonic insurgency, which already constitutes a clear majority of the population. What is most striking, despite the schisms, fractures, degrees of commitment, and tentativeness among many sectors of this majority, is the evident and quite dramatic growth of racial, sexual, and religious tolerance, which is amplified even further when broken down into age groups to show the swing and consolidating numbers in favor of tolerance and inclusion among younger cohorts. There is also, as an important implication of this, no consolidated sense of a social bloc or consensual understanding among the dominant elements of American society on the way forward for either the short or medium-term future. Equally striking is the deep disillusionment with capitalism, the inevitable result of the 2008 recession, and accompanying this, the growth of attractiveness to alternatives, though we should be careful as to what is meant when people declare in favor of socialism in the polls. While, therefore, this is a period of what we can term hegemonic transition towards dissolution, or a particular moment in which a clear majority, perhaps among the young and overwhelming majority, is open to a radically different image of American society, and faced with a sclerotic economic system or questioning capitalism itself, they are confronted with a regime elected by a minority of the voting population, which is anti-immigrant, willing to impose Jim Crow-like measures to deprive voting rights and gerrymander electoral seats, is climate, science, and truth-denying, homophobic in both rhetoric and policy measures, and willing to dismantle anything reeking of collective social responsibility. Most notably, the relatively conservative Obamacare health system. Does the Trumpian moment, therefore, herald the arrival of a new virile insurgency in the way in which Thatcherism, building on popular notions of individual freedom and wielding them to crush and sideline trade unions and a collective agenda, managed to negate and supersede state-led Keynesianism in the 1980s? While there were certain gestures from both Trump's campaign and the first year of governing that suggest that there was a recognition that perhaps people needed to be won to the project, the evidence as a whole leans away from this being the primary objective. What, however, seems to be the dominant trend since the January 2017 inauguration is a far darker three-pronged strategy, predicated first, not on winning over new converts, by assaulting the intellectual foundations of the opposition, but rather a determined attempt at consolidating base support among the minority of the mainly white voting population that is wedded to Trumpism. This is, I think, self-evident through his appeals to the worst racist and chauvinist tropes, even when he could have avoided alienating everybody else, as in his favorable coddling response to the Charlottesville alt-right neo-Nazi rally. The second is to use the power of the executive and existent Republican majorities at the state level to massage the electoral system through a combination of gerrymandering and voter restriction to ensure unassailable Republican majorities at both the state level and at the presidential via the Electoral College. Thirdly, and perhaps the most effective measure for the mid to long term, is its stacking of the judicial system with a raft of judges at all levels to assure the passage of questionable legislation and forestall any democratic reversals of the system in the near future. This is a very different and far more insidious option than in another era, the Thatcherite approach of populist authoritarianism, because it assumes that genuine populism is out of reach, that the majority is already lost to all reason. Its path to dominance, therefore, is underwritten by sleight of hand and ruse. In boldest terms, it is the framework for a soft judicial coup. The critical factor here is that older dominant hegemonic constructs are compromised. Clinton and Obama liberalism, while it shouldn't be forgotten that Hillary won the popular national vote, is seen by many as wedded to Wall Street and ultimately to the neoliberal Washington consensus. It still has not provided a credible explanation for the 2008 crisis that captures the predatory policies of the banks and financial institutions that led to the housing market bubble and brought the cards tumbling down. Its complicity is perhaps most evident in the failure of the Obama administration to convict any of the leading players. The counter-recessionary strategy of 2009 to 11 worked to forestall collapse, but was never followed by a long-term state-led strategy of economic restructuring, employment generation, and environmentally sustainable policies that might have captured the popular imagination and short-stopped the rise of Trump. The alternative and contending narrative on the left, evident in the Bernie Sanders candidacy and the upsurge of popular support in his favor, alongside popular protest movements such as Black Lives Matter and the movement against the Dakota Pipeline, remains relatively vibrant and attracts significant attention through both traditional and social media, but hasn't yet gelled into a viable and believable framework. Trumpian racism, chauvinism, and revanchism is institutionally in charge, but has no program nor interest in winning over a working majority of the population. The liberal center, while equivocating at best on the distinct struggles of important elements of the majority coalition, has very little that is new to offer as a broad platform for addressing imminent economic disruption and its social implications. Radical alternatives from the left, meanwhile, remain fragmented, are often at the margins of debate, and also have no concerted strategy for the near future. Gramsci described this moment in which old hegemonies are on the retreat, new ones are still in infancy, and there is at the same time no consolidated, if always temporary, hegemonic narrative, a moment of transition as a dangerous one. And I quote, "At a certain point in their historical life, social groups detach themselves from their traditional parties in that given organizational form, when the men who constitute, represent, and lead them are no longer recognized as a proper representation of their class or fraction of a class. When these crises occur, the immediate situation becomes delicate and dangerous, since the field is open to solutions of force, to the activity of obscure powers represented by, quote, men of destiny, unquote, or divine men, unquote." Sadly, there are precedents for times like this in relatively recent world history. Thus, it might be useful to refer to Hannah Arendt, who in The Origins of Totalitarianism speaks to the methods of totalitarians in waiting and points to their propensity for, and I'm going to use a number of quotes, I won't keep saying quote unquote here, points to their propensity for the rewriting of history, the need to give the appearance of infallibility, never admitting to wrongdoings. The fact that their propaganda is marked by its extreme contempt for facts as such. And poignantly, in light of prior discussion in this paper, that quote, I say quote this time, totalitarian propaganda can outrageously insult common sense only where common sense has lost its validity. Or even more ominously, her warning of, quote, the possibility that gigantic lies and monstrous falsehoods can eventually be established as unquestioned facts, that man may be free to change his own past at will, and that the difference between truth and falsehood may cease to be objective and become a mere matter of power and cleverness, of pressure and infinite repetition, unquote. Totalitarianism arises, she suggests, not in a moment of the dominance of the intellectual notions of the potential totalitarian party, but at the juncture of a battle for ideas in which the deeply untrue arguments are at first dismissed as bombastic and laughable, yet unwaveringly persist to be amplified, steadfast in the face of facts, until a crisis allows for power to be consolidated, at which point they are asserted by force as the only and then unassailable truth. The alarming reality today is that a regime reflecting many of these traits in its daily praxis is already in charge of the executive power of the most powerful country in the world, with its unrivaled array of weapons of mass destruction through offensive means and its soft power through policy and diplomatic channels. That, if deployed, could lead to the end of life as we know it. The failure so far of the liberal and left majority to elaborate and consolidate a vibrant new set of ideas, redefining the possibilities of social change that would address the sharp and growing inequalities of financial capitalism, the demands for popular inclusion from a multiracial, multi-ethnic society, and facing a robotic, cybernetic future, leaves the field open for the domination of dangerous men with messianic messages. The time for a new conversation and the patient building of new discourses is now and urgently necessary. Thank
you. Lisa will be speaking to us on migrant.
Well, I'm very glad to come after you, where you would be invoking Gramsci. I think I'm going to invoke Benjamin. An unprecedented number of people around the world displaced by war, famine, poverty, political instability, military coup, and environmental crises are living what Walter Benjamin called a state of emergency, which is not the exception but the rule. They are food refugees, climate refugees, and asylum seekers displaced by colonialism, genocide, land theft, rape, and torture. Forced migrants are today largely from the global south, and the longer history of colonialisms, armed conflicts, the Cold War, and neoliberal globalization create the conditions for their displacement and affect the situations into which migrants enter. The UN High Commission for Refugees estimates that in 2015, the total number of forcibly displaced peoples worldwide was approximately 64 million, the highest level since World War II. The more than 1 million arrivals to Europe were Syrian, Afghan, and Iraqi, making up the large majority of all refugees and migrants arriving in Europe across the Mediterranean. Well over 4 million Syrians are now refugees in 107 countries. The World Bank estimates that over 10 million people are displaced by so-called development projects, the construction of dams for hydroelectric power or irrigation, pipelines for drilling and mining, military installations and weapons testing, the building of roads and railways, and more. Most 20th century Asian and Pacific Islander migrants have been displaced by US militarism from the colonization of the Philippines, World War II, the Korean War, and the US war in Vietnam. Hundreds of thousands of people each year leave El Salvador, Honduras, Guatemala to go to Mexico, from where they then attempt to cross the border to the United States. Many migrants are internally displaced. Others are twice or thrice migrants, leaving one country of origin to relocate in another before moving on. Structural adjustment and austerity policies debt, and securitization have displaced migrants. Of course, the profitable national security industry further imperils migrants around the world. Companies like G4S, Academy, formerly Blackwater, and more, sell security services to states, embassies, and corporations. They run military prisons, detention centers, black sites, and extra-legal encampments. Their armies wage covert wars and counterinsurgency. Life as a migrant without papers is precarious. In the United States, where migrants are detained, persecuted, and deported, being undocumented may mean no work, working in toxic conditions for meager wages, or being barred from working in the fields or professions for which one was trained. Trump has not only signed executive orders to ban immigration from 6 Muslim-majority countries, Iran, Libya, Somalia, Sudan, Syria, and Yemen, he has increased the number of detention cells, expanded authority to ICE to deport, and vowed to punish cities and states who declare themselves sanctuaries. Haitian migrants were targeted last week when the Trump administration ended deportation protection for over 60,000 Haitian refugees in the US. Finally, environmental disasters such as the recent hurricanes in the Caribbean and the failure of government aid to the US territory of Puerto Rico, for example, has displaced tens of thousands of Puerto Ricans to Florida, New York, and elsewhere. Migrants are young and elderly, families, children on their own, queer folks crossing lands, negotiating deserts, making sea journeys, and confronting thieves and traffickers. As the numbers grow, documenting the figures, the rates, the routes, rather than the peoples or the processes and the histories that create the conditions for forced movement, has become the most common mode of representation. This regime of valuation risks depoliticizing the migrant to the degree that an aestheticized spectacle of statistics in the production of a crisis often stands in for analysis itself. Can I have the, sorry, I want to show a couple websites. Okay. Governmental and non-governmental organizations have mapped migrant movements, routes, and demography. For example, 15 Years Fortress Europe is an interactive map that lists and spatializes the death toll of migrants on the way to Europe or trying to stay in Europe. It documents over 32,000 deaths in 15 years. An enormous database, it permits one to click on a particular location. Let's see. I'm sorry, it's not working. There. Click on a particular location to discover data on the dead, missing, drowned, or suicided migrants. The data is used by news outlets, artists, NGOs, activists, and governments alike. And the project evokes mortality rates spatially and dynamically by route rather than by absolute numbers. In contrast, Watch the Med is an online mapping platform for a trans-border activist network. The media project intervenes in current migration struggles in the Mediterranean Sea in a multiplicity of ways. While it monitors the deaths and violations of migrants' rights at the maritime border of the EU, it also offers a mobile phone hotline for migrants who find themselves in temporary emergency zones, as well as a website that reports distress calls, excuse me. The website also maps, oh, I forgot to do sound. I'm sorry, I'm not a media person, Wendy. Here. It also maps border police locations, search and rescue points, and mobile phone coverage. It charts the number of safe migrations and numbers and locations of deaths, and it describes the militarization of the Mediterranean by Frontex, the EU Border Management Agency, and Operation Active Endeavor, launched after 9/11 to deter the threat of terrorism. The site map has this live feed of the optical and thermal camera surveillance by sea, air, and land-borne radars, vessel tracking technologies, and satellites to increase chances that migrants may actually navigate to avoid surveillance. The interactive platform, then, is an innovative virtual crossroads that instructs both activists. For example, excuse me, there is there's a page here how to report, how to give instruction when you receive a call, or instructs you what to do when you receive a call from a boat in distress. And it also instructs migrants themselves with pages on your rights at sea, maritime jurisdictions, rights to seek asylum, and so forth. The SHIFT teams speak Arabic, Farsi, Tigrinya, and other languages, other European languages. They offer information and assistance in arranging rescue by civilian fleet rather than by state authorities. Because many of its activities are clandestine, unauthorized, and not recognized, activist scholar Maurice Sturl describes the project as a type of transnational, transmedial underground railroad that heralds the instability of the European border regime. Watch the Med, unlike 15 Years Fortress Europe, does not merely collect data on migrant deaths. Rather, it operationalizes the emergence of new intimacies, cross-border kinships, and provisional communities. Closer to the United States, the Wall is an interactive border map of the border between the US and Mexico. It allows users to pick any spot on the interactive digital map and queue up an aerial video taken from a helicopter at that exact location, as well as to see the type of fencing that already exists along the border, beginning with aerial footage of the border that was gathered by the USA Today network. GIS mapping teams at the University of Texas and Arizona State Universities combined and synchronized that footage with federal maps and satellite imagery from the Department of Homeland Security to show a map that, quote, is billed as a pioneering border virtual reality. Here, let me do another one here. That enables viewers to have an immersive 3D on-the-ground experience of the border. The project description claims, quote, "Our map is totally objective. The map doesn't say the wall is a good idea or a bad idea. It simply shows the real world," unquote. As Trump pushes forward with his commitment to build a border wall, the map calls attention especially to, quote, "huge stretches of the border that are not fenced." There are about 1,350 miles of the open border that is without fencing. Alternatively, this GIS project by the Center for Investigative Reporting crowdsources current information about the US-Mexico border fence. So, for example, it provides information to migrants and travelers about which parts of the border has walling, the type, its features, and the likelihood of being detained. Let's see. So here, for example, you have a section with no walls yet. And then finally, the Transborder Migrancy Tool, designed by Ricardo Dominguez and new media artists at the Electronic Disturbance Theater Lab, is a cell phone app with a GPS system which provides experimental poetry aimed to inspire the migrant survival, as well as information on the location of food and water caches, where security patrols might be, and directions to potentially safer routes. Okay. We can observe that both national security and humanitarian conceptions of the migrant, invoked by some of the maps and digital platforms I've just shown you, tend to represent migrants in ways that confirm not only the normative geography of bounded nation states, but which also monitor and govern migrants in terms of normative narratives of political sovereignty, history, and society. Whether foreign threat or victim in need of rescue, the migrant is placed within an implied linear temporality of progress and development, exemplified by the reproduction of the south to north itinerary as the normative route of migration. To the contrary, the countries hosting the greatest numbers of refugees are actually in the global south. Many migrants go to Turkey, Lebanon, Iran, and Jordan. Pakistan takes in many West and South Asians. Chad, Ethiopia, Kenya, and Uganda are the destination of many sub-Saharan African migrants. Germany is the only European destination among the 10 countries hosting the largest numbers of refugees. However, in the Fortress Europe project, migrants are documented exclusively in their efforts to enter or land in Europe. Even the dynamic activist platform Watch the Med defines migrancy as people en route to Europe, and none of the US-Mexican border projects redefine or interrogate political sovereignty as the nation-state's jurisdiction over territory and population. A traditional understanding of sovereignty as the nation-state's power over land and people is evidently not merely a spatial representation. The spatial concept upholds a temporal development that reiterates the liberal political story of human freedom overcoming unfreedom through membership in the Western nation-state. For the larger part of the 20th century, the social sciences of sociology, political science, and economics have adopted a Weberian paradigm of modernization that would privilege Western forms of nation-state, industrialized society, and political economy. The migrant is figured in this through reference to this teleology of human development unfolding in time, consigned to what Dipesh Chakrabarty has called the waiting room of history within a modernist narrative that hierarchizes nations, races, and cultures in a linear development from primitive to civilized. Quantification and mapping produce and govern migrants as population. Furthermore, and maps emulate the aerial perspectives that have been central to the statecraft of foreign policy and war in the late modern period. Not only has the visual virtualization become central to the post-Vietnam conduct of late modern war, but a longer colonial history has employed the visual field to detect, produce, and administer colonized subjects and territory. Maps perform the omniscience and scientificity of what Martina Tazzoli and Glenda Garelli term a statist gaze, moving off of James Scott's work, as they seek to represent people in conditions that are entirely uncertain and constantly in motion. Defining and mapping the migrant as imperiled trespasser of the nation-state confirms liberal orthodoxies of sovereignty and territory, juxtaposing the migrant to the settler-citizen subject and homo economicus figured as human by the Western liberal political tradition. More importantly, the figuration of the migrant in a proliferating language of crisis, the migration crisis, the crisis of the Middle East, the financial crisis, often obfuscates and depoliticizes the historical contradictions of which the forced movement, its criminalization, and the multiplication of borders and border zones is the expression. The language of crisis is crucial for the reproduction of capitalism, of course, and is evidently exploited as the occasion for capitalism's neoliberal renewal and restructuring in the imposition of aggressive privatization and unrestricted movements of capital, tax breaks and brutal austerity measures, and the evisceration of social welfare while demonizing the quote-unquote undeserving poor. Crisis works as well, as Zahid's discussion of the uncanny haunting of the law by impunity so well elaborated. Crisis works as well to refortify and justify states' absolute monopoly on force and violence, whether as the buildup of policing, border patrols, drug enforcement and prisons, or as nuclear proliferation, military basing, and the pursuit of military supremacy. The affective deployment of crisis masks material histories and focuses public attention instead on migration as a contemporary presentist phenomenon, rather than as a history of the present that would defamiliarize the present and link the conditions of forced migration with the longer undisclosed histories that produce them. A history of the present would refuse the simple recovery of the past and trouble the givenness or the inevitability of the present formation. It is not a historical reconstruction that justifies the present, but a critical project that exposes existing conventions for knowing and representing modernity through narratives of progress and development, and thus releases our present from the dictates of those conventions. Contrary to the single figuration of the migrant as the outsider whom the nation-state must either rescue or deport, migrant life is not a single condition, of course, but many different ones, historically and in the present. In the modern period of nations and empires, the migrant has heralded the fragmentation brought into being by the contradictory ambitions and failures of settler colonialism, militarized war, and empire after the alleged stabilities of liberal modernity, as Brian Meek's paper has demonstrated so well. Migration heralds, in this way, the unfinished work of decolonization, the failures of global capitalism, the shrill violence of white racial supremacy, national security regimes, and moreover, the inadequacy of liberal political representation and free market fundamentalism or the authoritarian states to manage or resolve these failures. In this sense, the figure of the migrant today refers not just to mass movement and displacement, it is also an expression of the precarity of the claims to resolution. It's in this sense that the migrant struggles in what Benjamin terms a state of emergency that is not the exception but the rule. Fascism may not be a breakdown of liberal sovereignty, but rather a continuation of the historical forms of arbitrary and authoritarian rule and subjection, opened by the fabric of liberal democratic capitalism. The migrant may also be a sign of our difficulty in reading the object of the global present, marking the gap between political discourse and material conditions themselves. In this sense, I want to underscore that I'm distinguishing a typology of the migrant from the shifting, undocumented immeasurability of migrant worlds or migrant lives. It's also necessary to emphasize that the migrant is different than the immigrant. For where the migrant is figured as perpetually eluding the state, the immigrant is subjected to the state and is domesticated by the promises of national assimilation and citizenship. Immigrants are forced to comply with the narratives of rehabilitation, cure, conversion, and national belonging. But the migrant from whom citizenship is withheld is the disquieting, the repudiated not same. The migrant defies and deranges and is thus simultaneously more vulnerable and more transgressive than the immigrant. The migrant is stateless, homeless, and rightless, the target of police, armies, counterinsurgency, and biomedicine, subjected to the extraction of surplus value, surveillance, and carceral enclosure. In the discourses of authoritarian states like the United States, the migrant is the state's reification of its national limit, and not to be confused with migrating peoples themselves, whose lives and survivals are always in excess of the representation of their disposability as the migrant. The migrant is rapidly conflated in this way with other figures, equally constructed as threats to national security, homogeneity, and coherence, such as the terrorist, the queer, the diseased, the infidel, the oriental, or the disabled. These figures mark the threshold of the nation and herald its contradictions. They are supplements that at once must be banned and yet destabilized in their very objection. They figure the cultural negativity that refuses integration into the dominant social order. The state's figuration of the migrant mediates the endless production of difference, of good and bad Muslims, of inside and outside, of the normative and the deviant, from which society must be defended. Yet migrant life and survival also recast the targeting and production of the migrant as an expression of key shifts in the rise and transformation of US-led global empire and global warfare. In other words, The US state targets and produces the migrant as the limit of national sovereignty and social order, even as it continues to translate the migrant into the immigrant through the visibility, legality, and temporality of the liberal political sphere, and to prey upon what remains of migrant lives and labor in the economic sphere. Migrants are portrayed by some states and non-state agencies as meriting protection insofar as they conform to a criteria of unfreedom that can be redeemed within liberal regimes of promised freedom. In transit zones such as the Idomeni camp at the Greek-Macedonian border, or in makeshift camps at Calais, France, where tents and shacks sheltered refugees until it was cleared last year, the military policing of migrant populations is presented through humanitarian rhetorics of protection and rescue. The combination of militarized governance and humanitarian care, of course, has a long colonial history that Neda Atanasosky has analyzed as humanitarian violence, as restating international divisions of political power and justifying its interventions in terms of suffering victims in need of care. Whether as foreign threat or abject victim, security and humanitarian discourses converge around a construction of the migrant as voiceless, which totalizes state sovereignty while evacuating migrant subjectivity and political possibility, and also obscuring other forms, itineraries, and temporalities of being. Migrant life both attracts yet exceeds the capture by both the humanitarian and security gazes. Driven from one's land or prevented from returning to one's land, hiding, fleeing, surviving occupation, enduring deportation, being poor, growing poorer, forced to reproduce, prohibited from reproducing. Migrant experiences and histories are forms of undocumented knowledge. Itinerant movements, practices, and epistemologies escape representation and are not apprehended by the state that documents only its engagements with its institutions. In this way, migrant life forces a reckoning of existing political and aesthetic regimes of representation. Migrant life, labor, and survival, in a sense, defies the narratives of political struggle for emancipation that draw upon the very historic binary of freedom and unfreedom, and must be imagined as resembling something more like what Nefertiti Tadjar terms remaindered life. Nefertiti Tadjar examines the leftover, devalued, sensorial practices of the unfree, those persons, particularly women, who are obligated, owned, indentured, or instrumentalized. In her work, she looks particularly at Filipino domestic laborers and sex workers. And remaindered life describes the everyday transactions of exchange, cooperation, and dependence as rights of collective enjoyment, perseverance, and relation. The transient spaces of refuge and practices of transit and survival are evidently much more heterogeneous, contested, and multidimensional than either the humanitarian or security border regime can capture or envision. Moreover, the exclusive binary analysis of either captive unfreedom or redemptive freedom enunciates a form of the political that forecloses alternative subjectivities, other ephemeral survivals and solidarities within migrant border worlds. Nick Mertzoff's work on colonial visual culture suggests that insurgent forms such as cinema or photography may not only seize the gaze from the state and humanitarian hands, but perhaps experimental visual forms can also suggest more complex aesthetic and political representation. In this regard, I wanted to show one more. It's not essential. In this regard, I wanted to mention briefly an experimental film. I'm not going to show a clip from it because it will take too long. Maquilapolis, produced by Vicky Funari and Sergio de la Torres, is a collaboration between Latinas in the US and Mexicanas who work with experimental media to represent the transnational politics of young migrant women who travel from southern Mexico to work in the border maquiladora factories. Of course, since the 1970s, US investors have profited enormously from manufacturing and export processing zones around the world, including cities along the US-Mexican border, which employ hundreds and thousands of girls and young women, exploiting their structural vulnerability in family, society, and in the factories themselves. For Mexico's centralized government and the large state-run unions who view the maquiladoras as a strategy for national development, the revenues have been a disincentive to recognizing or protecting the women workers, hundreds of whom have been murdered with impunity in places like Ciudad Juarez. Multivocal and multi-perspectival, the film Maquilapolis is composed of video segments that the women have filmed and narrated, portraying arrivals at the border from rural Mexico, their discoveries of toxic conditions in their workplace and in their colonias, and their decision to take action and become promotoras to educate other women. These particular stories are enfolded within a narration about the growth of the maquiladora industry. The camera itself is mobilized as a product assembled by the women in the maquilas, but also as a metaphor and a medium for seeing and being seen, as an apparatus constituting the very means of representation. The film opens, for example, with Carmen holding a camera explaining, "My name is Carmen Duran. I have worked in 9 assembly plants. I was 13 years old when I arrived in Tijuana." Soon after, another woman, Lourdes, tells the viewer she is turning the camera on to show us the toxic river of lead slag and sulfuric acid running through her neighborhood, Chilpancingo, explaining that her children and her neighbors are at high risk for leukemia, cancer, and anencephaly. And she then uses the camera on her own body, pointing to the lesions and sores on her skin from toxic chemicals and mineral waste. Carmen films her daily routine, feeding and bathing her children in their house without running water, that she has assembled out of discarded garage doors that she bought in the United States. She films going to work in the factory and explains that her exposure to poisonous chemical fumes and lead contamination in the factory means that she cannot wash her own work clothes with her children's clothes. What's crucial is that the movement and the transformation of perspective is thematized throughout the film in sound, image, and narrative form. The women record the shift from being objectified as commodified yet disposable labor to becoming a subject who films oneself as an analyst of these conditions and as a social actor working against them. In one segment, Carmen films Lourdes as Lourdes films the US side of the border through a space in the corrugated metal wall that divides the two countries. Quote, "I'm looking at the other side of the border. This is something so new for me," her voiceover explains. Lourdes, looking at the side of the border that constitutes her as disposable, refutes the status gaze, and Carmen, looking at Lourdes, refutes a colonial politics of recognition. Contrary to state and industry discourses that see the women as docile or passive, their experiment in looking and looking away is part of their collaborative struggle against toxicity, in which migrant women reverse the discourse of female disposability. Countering the industrial toxification that subject their communities to death, they refuse to be less than living. The film suggests a concept of the political that does not depend upon normative models of political sovereignty or rights-based citizenship, and whose strategies necessarily reach beyond traditional state channels. Furthermore, their anti-toxicity struggle challenges and complicates existing political paradigms, whether nationalist, trade unionist, or feminist. The film ends with the decade-long collaboration between their collective with the Environmental Health Coalition in the United States, having created enough public international pressure to obligate both the Mexican and the US states to jointly clean up the lead waste in their particular colonia, depicting an alternative practice of sovereignty or the exercise of political power, which counters the state-sanctioned death of migrants in the border community. Yet the film ends with Lourdes commenting that with still hundreds of polluting factories, the future is quite uncertain. Confining the migrant to a traditional notion of political sovereignty entraps the migrant life further. Where territoriality is one way of conceptualizing political sovereignty, sovereignty also regulates the character of movement, attempting to determine whether people may move as citizens or slaves, legal or smuggled. But as migrants defy this regulation, it exposes the degree to which the totalizing understanding of sovereignty, I have 1.5 pages left, The totalizing understanding of sovereignty is fictional in that it is perpetually incomplete and failing. The state is not the source of power, but its effect. States are rather constituted by their performances of sovereignty, often performed in relation to an outside against which they define themselves. In this sense, we ourselves perform the state's work when we recenter sovereignty in the state, or continue to reify the migrant and subordinating migrant lives in relation to the state view. If modern political philosophy is founded on the dialectic of unfreedom and freedom, and our political imagination is still haunted by its teleology, its narrative organization and dialectical temporality, then perhaps the migrant might inaugurate a different political concept, not limited by the organizing teleology of emancipation. The migrant whose itineraries elude the binary of freedom and unfreedom might be a means to explore other vocabularies, other frameworks or practices to reckon with the conditions, past and present, offering alternative modalities for framing the political, not as a state of unfreedom to be overcome by political emancipation, but as a way to conceptualize political subjectivity as being with, rather than having, owning, or regulating. Migrant life is both an exception to dominant forms of national and imperial identity, and one that challenges and complicates abstract subjects of oppositional paradigms that require individual standpoints or identities, whether anti-colonial or anti-racist nationalisms, Marxisms, or feminisms. For the migrant is not an identity, but is heterogeneous, shifting, and unsettles the binary framework upon which the dominant and some of our oppositional political projects have been built. White, non-white, settler, indigenous, civilized, uncivilized, male, female, developed, undeveloped, and so forth. Like indigenous theorist Jody Bird's category of the arrivant, the migrant complicates the dyad of settler and native, for there are many kinds of migrant lives, and arriving is not a monolithic, stable, or permanent position. Migrant life refers us to a different aesthetics of representation, one that challenges mimesis and verisimilitude, one that radically challenges teleological and developmental narratives of emancipation and assimilation, and interrupts presumptions of stability, location, and habitation and territory. Walter Benjamin wrote in 1940 that, quote, "The tradition of the oppressed teaches us that the state of emergency in which we live is not the exception but the rule. We must attain to a conception of history that is in keeping with this insight. Then we shall clearly realize that it is our task to bring about a real state of emergency, and this will improve our position in the struggle against fascism." One reason why fascism has a chance is that in the name of progress, its opponents treat it as a historical norm. The current amazement that the things we are experiencing are still possible is not philosophical. This amazement is not the beginning of knowledge, unless it is the amazement that registers that this view of history is untenable, unquote. The migrant invites an aesthetics of disidentification that refers us to this understanding of history, and another form of the political, one that no longer rests upon the fulcrum of freedom and unfreedom, which might permit us to name the fascism of our moment and to bring about a state of emergence from the state of emergency. Thank you.
So we have time. We have time for about 35 minutes worth of questions. I'll keep a list going. Claire, would you like to start us off, and then Nick?
So thank you so much for two fantastic papers. I guess my question is about strategies for resistance. And I think it's a question that is likely to be pertinent for both speakers, but I'm gonna respond specifically to one point that you made, Brian. In terms of, you described the left and the alternative it proposes as fragmented. And I was wondering, you know, given the very multifaceted and multidimensional forms that this particular moment, political moment takes, but at perhaps all moments, in terms of its colonialism and sexism and heteronormativity and xenophobia and racism and environmental devastation, et cetera, which I think the thinking of the figure of the migrant actually speaks to, right? Given that multifaceted character, is fragmentation actually potentially something positive? And what does it mean to claim that the left and its alternatives are fragmented? Does it follow from such a claim that there should be unity? What kind of unity, what would the potential risk for obscuring certain alternatives be if this implies unity, right? So what is being obscured, I guess? And I wonder if the left is indeed fragmented, then what kind of fragments may, for instance, the women of the Maquila Polis be, right? And aren't these actually powerful fragments? Isn't a strategy of resistance perhaps a strategy of trying to become untractable? So, thank you.
We can start with just one at a time, and please.
Thanks, Claire. Basically, I didn't mention the word unity at all. I think there are need for coalitions, which are a different thing from unity. Unity implies some sort of homogeneity, which by definition you've already said and have said, not only doesn't exist, but is necessary to have. But the question is, there's a politics here that has not sufficiently been invoked surrounding coalitions, and it seems to me that the politics of it, which I haven't mentioned at all, I've talked about discourses that need to be generated, but the politics of it requires thought about what are the channels. There was a channel, the Bernie Sanders channel, which was remarkable in terms of the support it gained, but not enough to overcome the barricades of the DNC. What are the forms of strategies, and what are the compromises that need to be made in the component parts? And it's this sort of discussion. In other words, what would a movement like Black Lives Matter want to assure that is not lost were to enter a coalition with feminist groups, LGBTQ groups, and what would they in turn compromise in a strategy that was genuinely broad-based and didn't require a subsuming of their demands under some broad banner. So it seems to me that this is quintessential politics, but it's the politics of coalitions.
Lisa, did you want to speak?
Well, I'll just say it in one word.
Sure.
I'm not in the, I think I don't want to prescribe what kinds of practical organizing could take place, because I think the task was more to think about how our concept could be generative of new ways of thinking. But I think that what I was trying to suggest is that different, I mean, I'm not sure coalition would be one way of talking about it, but that there would be, it might be necessary to recognize forms of struggle that would be around particular provisional sites as opposed to nation-bound or ones that prescribed, for example, international proletariat that would mandate a particular kind of formation. So I was trying to be suggestive about the ways in which the anti-toxicity, anti-globalization feminist struggle that's being described is a representational project that might open up other ways of thinking politically.
Yeah.
Hey everyone, can you hear me? So Lisa, this is for you, and thank you for the shout out. I appreciate it. I was scribbling down notes while you talked, so it's possible that while I was doing that, you said what I'm going to ask you about. So, but you made me think about kind of frontiers of migration, if you like, in different ways. And so, I mean, I was thinking about Wall Street as a wall that was built by enslaved African labor to keep out the unhappy. So that there is a way in which this has a very long history in the history of settler colonialism. And yet, I mean, you used this very trenchant phrase where you talked about migration is the unfinished work of decolonization. And that made me start thinking about Palestine. And I wanted to ask you about that and to think about the way in which, you know, there are only 2 countries in the world where the United States is now more popular than it was before Trump got in. One is Russia, obviously, and the other is Israel. And when one thinks of the condition of the Palestinians as sort of fundamentally both refugees and migrants, but migrants within their own space, and the question of mapping has become very critical in the sense that there are no maps of Palestine. If you go on the West Bank, you turn Google Maps on, you get blank space, you know. So B'Tselem in Israel and Zakat and other organizations have been producing maps to show what is otherwise not shown. And it seemed to me to be a kind of paradigm case of what you're talking about. So I wondered if you might want to think a little bit about this debate that's been going on. Michael Hart and others have sort of said Palestine is the exemplary rather than the exceptional. And there's been some pushback on that. And I just wondered how it might fit within your framework that you set up here for us.
Well, I wrote out a whole part of the paper that was about 5 broken cameras. I don't know if you know this film, which is so, you know, it uses the camera as well in Berlin, so that it gets smashed each time by Israeli soldiers or various, you know, the process of building settlements and that sort of thing. I mean, absolutely, I think that Palestine is an example in which they're occupied. First of all, there's Palestinians in Israel, they're in the West Bank, they're in Gaza. There are migrants, internal migrants, there are migrants in their own location. I hesitate to say paradigmatic, but certainly not an exception to what I'm trying to describe. Yeah, thank you for the question. Did you want to say something?
No. It's just an argument that I made and agree with you very much. Leila, please.
Thank you. Thank you for those absolutely wonderful papers. I have a question for Brian, but very much provoked by material in Lisa's paper. Brian, if I'm, in a way, both talks seem to be about the problem of the dissolution of traditional forms of sovereignty. But Brian, your account of this dissolution was immediately to see it as an index of the failure of the political. And which you diagnosed very stirringly via the Gramscian precedent as the problem of social groups dissociating from traditional forms of behavior. I just want to ask whether I could urge you both to think more about the political possibilities of dissociation and disengagement. And here, of course, there are 2 types. One Lisa touches upon by speaking about the creative disidentification of new subaltern groups with existing or traditional forms of power. But may I touch upon another slightly more complicated form of disidentification, but also very productive, taking, say, this gathering as a paradigm, where the problem is not that you see yourself, that a few, enough, see themselves as subject to hegemony, but as stakeholders in it. Say here, politics that might arise from in various contexts, and there are various contexts here besides Trump, but more of that later today or tomorrow. Say the problem of being white and male. Say in another context, the problem of being unbearably upper caste Hindu male. And there are endless such examples of the unbearable burden of being nominated as a stakeholder by the prevailing form of hegemony. And does that not produce then a certain pressure on another kind of political? So that's really
Thanks, Leila. I'm not sure if I understood where you were going with disassociation and exactly if you'd elaborate on that a little more, and you can come back to that. But on the question of stakeholders, my notion and the way in which I use hegemony, it's always a two-way negotiation. It's never imposed always from above. It's by people incorporating themselves and seeing themselves as you correctly put it, as stakeholders in the process. So you have stakeholders who are on Wall Street, and you have stakeholders who are in Appalachia, but they see themselves as benefit and absorb that sense of the dominant discourse in a way which satisfies them. So I see this thing as far more temporary and flexible. I use a notion of a netting as opposed to some sort of solid ceiling around which things. But at the same time, a netting serves a purpose. It may have holes in it. It may not. But it does hold some fish. Yeah. So that's my answer, and I agree with you that it very strongly that discussion of the stakeholders is critical. But I'd love to hear your disassociation point elaborated a little more so that I can respond maybe or not respond, as the case may be.
Lisa, let you.
Yeah.
I think you were referring to the type of discussion that I was presenting, which is that these maquiladora workers are not primarily struggling as workers, though their migrancy is part of their economic condition. They're not primarily struggling as Mexicanas. They are a cross-border group that rely upon collaborations with people in the United States. They're organizing around a profound condition of toxicity brought on by global capitalism, but through means that put pressure on different states, but don't see the states as the guarantors of their freedom or liberation or emancipation. So I think I was trying to precisely point to ways in which our traditional notions of sovereignty may, if we follow them too closely, we may inadvertently re-imprison new political possibility in the old categories. And so I think there is the possibility that I'm not quite sure I understand your stakeholders and hegemony idea with respect to the subaltern, because the subaltern are not always thought of as stakeholders in hegemony, but there might be a way in which this disidentification with traditional categories might help counter-hegemonic insurgent actions to reimagine themselves differently, not as monolithic unities, not as state-bound, not as race-bound. So, for example, Brian, you were gesturing towards an emergent kind of black counter-hegemonic possibility with the collapse of capitalism, but it might include also Asians. It might also include with these women at the border. It might not necessarily have to be captured by a particular unity. And so I think that's why you didn't say unity.
Did you want to say something just in
say
response?
Thank you both very much. I think and my apologies for this, that there are, I think I just wanted to speak about two figures of disidentification that might be producing this dissolution of hegemony that you're both so powerfully diagnosing. One, of course, new subaltern groups. But then the other, I think I'm also interested in unwilling elite groups. And those who don't want their own whiteness, those who don't want their own Brahminism, those who don't want their own maleness, these may be less few and far between, Brian, you suggested optimistically, and that produces its own kind of disidentification. I'm just thinking of what we're doing here. Look at the privilege, the unbearable privilege that we have. Look at, and trying and not to be contaminated by Trumpism, where the problem is that many of us are. There's a new opportunity, and that is unbearable. So I suppose the problem of both new subaltern and ethically vexed elite groups as well. Thank you very much.
Malay?
So should I take the mic or?
Sure, please. Or one of them. Closer.
So my question was largely for Lisa's presentation. Thank you very much. I think the question that I had at the difficulty concerned this sort of inauguration of the refugee as this sort of limit or litmus test for concepts in political theory, right? And it's a common enough, I think it's symptomatic of our time that the refugee now is so often spoken of as that limit point for various ordering categories, sovereignty being among them. But one of the things that, I do research on Syrian refugees in Jordan and Lebanon, and one of the complications that I've had with my project is also trying to understand the ways in which humanitarian care and the humanitarian institutions that one finds, UNHCR being one of them, but it's a sprawling nexus, that mass displacement also calls forth new forms of state institutions, not just in the form of humanitarian violence, which I think you described so well, but also in the form of biopolitical care. And biopolitical care as a form of control. I mean, after the European migrant crisis, Europe was pumping a lot of money into Jordan and Lebanon, into its education and health sectors, presumably to keep refugees there. The irony is that that project is largely failing. And in most of my interviews with Syrian refugees, one of the things that keeps coming up as a kind of contrast is how sustaining strong state institutions in Syria were compared to Jordan and Lebanon. So for instance, free healthcare, free education, up until a certain point. I'm not talking about higher education. And one of the, and the constant invocation of the necessity for strong state institutions. And the idea that the reason why humanitarian care is failing is because it cannot do that. It cannot live up to those roles and responsibilities. So I was kind of wondering how does one theorize that too? You've referred several times in the talk to alternative political subjectivities outside the state. And I don't know whether I find freedom there either. And I was kind of wondering what does that work of theorizing an alternative subjectivity outside the terminology of the state actually look like?
So what I'm describing actually I don't believe is incompatible with what you're saying. So I'm not saying that there isn't humanitarian care that continues to make migrant lives living. But that it's a form of governance that sometimes converges with state governance and sometimes is another net of governance, the biopolitical. I'm not trying to, in the description, I'm not trying to say it's positive or negative, but that it isn't freedom. And so I'm trying to suggest that we may be in a political moment in which freedom and unfreedom, and that very weighty dialectic that has framed so much of our political thinking, might not be the adequate description for our projects now. So I think that was in a way, it's just a small observation. But I don't think I think what you're saying is compatible with what I'm describing.
Jack, please.
Thank you. Yeah, Lisa, I wanted to ask you, maybe following up on that point and following up on Leila's question about what happens, what are the implications for the nation state in which what you suggest if we build a sort of new political imaginary around the migrant, which I think sounds fantastic. For James Scott, that means movement towards anarchy. And so, you know, his next couple of books, he's pretty explicit about that. So I wanted to ask you about anarchy, and you know, I don't mean the anarchy of the early 20th century, but whether there are forms of anarchy that actually are suggested by the migrant, by not necessarily the refusal of the state, but the failure of the state to even accommodate larger numbers of people. So that's one thing that I wanted to ask. And while I like that film and I have used it, I wonder if it belongs to even an earlier order, you know, sort of NAFTA moment. And I wanted to suggest a different text, not a visual text. I think we've discussed it before. This book, Exit West, by Mohsin Hamid, which when I read it, it's a sort of dystopian near-future fantasy set in an unnamed Middle Eastern city where people pay coyote type of agents to give them access to a portal that will deliver them to various sites. And so a Muslim couple leave the city, they go through a portal, and they end up in Lesbos, which is interesting, in Greece, because the trajectory of the book is actually they exit to the west, they end up in Greece and then London, where they do not find at all what they're looking for. They find new forms of racism. So they exit from the west, and then the final piece of the book is they exit to San Francisco, where the female partner becomes a lesbian, which then I was like, okay, this sounds more interesting now, because it's actually charting a kind of political trajectory based on exit. And I wanted to see if we could do something, you know, and I think the lesbianism piece is interesting because it becomes, in so many political projects, the unthinkable, the place that can't be inhabited, that was never interesting politically, that no one wants to be in. It is the site of political disidentification. So I want, you know, and there are lots of people who talk about exit. There's Paolo Verno, there's Exodus in Heart and Agree, there's Escape in Moten and Hani. So is exit something we could use, and is exit a portal, if you like, for new forms of anarchy? Is that where we go with the migrant?
Well, that's so suggestive, and I know that you're going to speak about anarchy, so I'm not going to try to say too much about anarchy. But I think the question of what happens to the nation state is interesting, because if we're de-investing in national citizenship and borders, then where could that energy and resource go? It could go back towards creating sustenance for many different kinds of communities, some of whom might not be only American. So I think that's what I'm gesturing towards. I don't have a kind of blueprint for how that would take place, but I think I'm interested in the disidentification with national citizenship and the nation state.
Yeah.
So it seems to me among historians, there's a whole attempt to figure that out by going back to what people like Gary Wilder and Max Tomba and Kristen Ross call the foreclosed moments of alternatives to the solidification of the nation state. And it's worth, I think, looking at how they handle that to try to think otherwise about communities, grassroots communities that form associations of a kind that the Paris Commune being Kristen Ross's exemplary moment. Yeah.
So I just wanted to take the liberty of making one statement here, and it's going to not be a very popular one. I think we're at a political moment in which we're desperate to imagine that a new politics is possible, and that a new politics is coming out of something that, as you said so well, Joan, is not a new politics from Trump, but that the contra-politics that we're establishing, the only way that politics could matter, this contra movement.
Don't call it contra. Yeah.
Oh, okay. Okay, oppositional, is if it produces sabotage in certain ways, because we've had so many counter movements that retract themselves actually from participation, that that are no longer identify with the state, with society, with, I mean, we've all been part of them in minimal and major ways. What this new political moment would need to do would actually put a wrench in what's happening. And I don't know if, even with all of our desire to see in this migrant situation, these new political possibilities, this new partage de sensible, as Rancière would say, a new way of dividing and sharing in our senses. I don't know if that's really the case. I don't, Susan.
Yeah, I'm going to sound very conservative at this point. I understand doing away with nation state. I understand doing away with sovereignty. But the category of citizen is the one because Jared Kushner wants to do away with it, I'm very nervous about. I don't know why, because citizen is not just national citizen. Citizen is as old as the Greek polis, which is not a nation state, even though polis has been translated by Hobbes as nation state, the first translation of Thucydides into English in 1629. But that is not the meaning of the term. It means, it has an attachment to public space. It has an attachment to getting away from, I happen to be white, or I happen to be this, or I happen to be that, and to actually be where I take a stand with others because of my moral commitments, going back to Zahid. I don't think that is part of, I don't think that citizen is reducible to either national sovereignty or the nation state.
And by accident, I have to excuse myself, skipped over Akil, who I hope he's coming back.
Again, let me try to say that I don't think that I'm saying we should all become migrants and give up our citizenship. I'm trying to suggest that the unbelonging of migrants is suggestive about the degree to which we could unreify the citizen of the nation state and national boundaries as our primary guarantors that we could retrieve liberal democracy. I think there's a way in which what I'm suggesting is that the particular forms of liberal democracy in the US with global capitalism has actually allowed this authoritarianism to come in. It's not opposed to it, it's part of it. So it's not that I'm romanticizing the migrant and that we should all be migrants, but there's a status of unbelonging that is suggestive to the types of political projects that we might rethink. Yeah, that's all I'm saying.
Adi?
I want to ask Brian to respond to this, because I think that I want to ask Brian to respond to this discussion, because as I understood you, holding to the concept of hegemony is holding to some kind of synoptic view of society and social order, and expecting a very dangerous moment in between two imagery of social order, but hoping for another one, which will be better. And what I hear in what Lisa suggested, and also developed by Lila and some, and I think Jack as well, is something I would like to call, and not pejoratively, the politics of the bubble. No, it's not pejorative. This is the kind of politics of the bubble. This is the kind of politics that I practiced in Palestine, Israel. That was the only possibility of surviving, is to withdraw into a bubble in which you can care to the people around you and to some students and some Palestinians that you meet here and there, or something like this, and not more, without hoping for anything larger or more significant than this.
Here now.
It's another bubble. Yes, so we can move from bubble to bubble, giving up this. Now, I'm really serious. The question is this the only possibility, because we have to give up not only the nation state and capitalism, etc. We have to give up the pretension to understand the world in such a way that we can amend it. The world.
Yeah, I like what you're saying, in the sense that I'm worried about where Lisa and the discussion that has followed from it is going, because it seems to me that this question of unknowing and unbelonging on the border is the way that black people in the United States have felt since they came here, and they're still here, and the avenue that they've used to fight that is to form the necessary political arrangements to do battle with that real force that is still all around them and so dominant, called the state at the local level. And it seems to me that we're making a leap into a post-statal phase when the state is still very much here and still very much in power and still very much exerting that power in a virile sense, in a very masculinist and virile sense. I don't know if that's the way in which you're using bubble, but certainly that's the way I'm interpreting a bubble. That what is this thing? I mean, where's that going? And I say this, it's not a pejorative question either, but where is the discussion going? It seems to me the discussion needs to be around how do we find the necessary relationships, integuments, political strategies to unite, not unite. I trip my own self, but to find the necessary bonds to hold together a coalition of the majority. This is a peculiar moment we're in. It's a coalition of the majority, but it is a fractured coalition. And through that, do battle with the state to address these questions. The state is still here. The state is still powerful.
So we have really only a few.
Okay, I'm going to try to explain this again. I'm not trying to suggest withdrawing into a bubble, and I'm not trying to suggest giving up the state or citizenship, but I'm talking about different temporalities here in which we might seriously think about what it means not to depend on the state as the sole guarantor of freedom, and think about building coterminously with various kinds of coalition struggles and acting as citizens, other kinds of subjectivity and being with and community and forms of struggle. So I'm pointing to the migrant, not that we should all be the migrant, but the way in which thinking through migration, through this freedom and freedom temporality will only further abject them. So what does that tell us?
Stephen and Rebecca, and that's it, unfortunately. Were you waiting then?
David.
Oh, you.
David, but Stephen.
David, I'm sorry.
I'll take Stephen, it's okay. It strikes me that there are some maybe old-fashioned, not so fashionable terms that are helpful here. I mean, because, when I was listening to Susan and Leela, that there's an argument about power and recognition that's operating here, right? And so, where's that power going to come from, given the desperation that you spoke of, Anne, right? Yeah. Given this moment of desperation, that the politics of the bubble might be necessary as moments, away from the fray, to recuperate. But neither the publicness nor the privateness thoroughly describe the politics. Neither the publicness nor the privateness thoroughly, adequately represent the kinds of recognition that we're seeking, right? And so, in this moment where the disruptive recognition is only a moment. It's only a moment. And I think that's what I took from you, Lisa, right? It's only a moment. Somehow to break space from that. Yeah, well, it's a bubble, but, bubbles burst, right? Bubbles burst. Hopefully they burst. And so that, you know, that we take some hope and solace from that, but it's not where all the politics resides.
It's,
It's
Rebecca.
neither the end nor the continuing
well,
modality.
it's where Hannah Arendt leaves us a little high and dry, because she really, really, you know, keeps the social as apart from the political. And what we're arguing this moment, it's absolutely impossible, nor do we want to do that.
I don't know. I think, you know, this is fantastic discussion, and I think the question should not all be the migrants. I don't know. I mean, I think maybe we should be. And also, I think actually what we should all be is the toxins. You know, I think that
That's
this
exactly
this
something.
kind of question of letting the toxins speak in the maquiladoras example is an indication of a new politics that doesn't want to sort of go back to a model. And here, you know, obviously I'm calling on Mel Chen to the table, but you know, the question of migrancy being the unfinished business of decolonialism, it's also the unfinished business of capitalism. I mean, you know, the migrant is like the toxin produced by capitalism. And so to go with the migrant doesn't necessarily exit capitalism, but it does ask us to, you know, look at capitalism from another position of that which is the abjected refuse of capitalism. And so I almost think that the thing I have the problem with is the language of the emergence of a new politic. And I would rather think about with people like Jody Bird, like Leanne Simpson, like Glenn Coulthard, with the word resurgence, a resurgence of, like Joan was suggesting, and as Jack's work on failure manifests too, these still residing alternative possibilities that could resurge. Because I think the language of the new and of emergence is just another way of, you know, keeping us within the same kind of poison. Not the poisons of that.
Thank you for starting to clap. That's a great place to end. Thank you all.